Hi everyone, we're about to get started. Thank you all for joining us. Again, if you can't hear anything again, just as a note we put in the chat, if you have any questions, please let us know. We are speaking now and getting things started. So if you're having trouble with your audio, you may want to check your settings or feel free to put any questions in the chat. We want to thank you all for joining us today for an introduction to Meridian and the Meridian Discovery Portal. This webinar is being hosted by Portage in collaboration with Carl. So just some housekeeping notes before we get started. You will be muted automatically when you've entered the webinar room, and you may have already noticed this. The webinar is going to be recorded, and the chat also might be archived for those who are unable to attend. We encourage everyone to use the latest version of Zoom so that you have access to all of the features. Please use the chat feature if you are having technical difficulties or have additional resources to share. We encourage you to use the Q&A option to ask questions of the presenters. Questions will be addressed at the end. You may also use the raising your hand feature if you wish to ask a question. Questions may be asked in English or French. We abide by the code of conduct provided by Carl. Carl is committed to providing a welcoming, safe, and harassment-free environment for its staff, membership, committees, and working groups, as well as for participants, speakers, and organizers of Carl meetings and events. We do not tolerate harassment of any kind. So just an introduction to our presenters today. Casey Hilliard is the Senior Data Manager with Meridian. Casey is a Senior Data Manager with Meridian located in the Institute for Big Data Analytics at Dalhousie University. His background is in GIS, spatial programming, system administration, and marine traffic modeling. Within Meridian, he leads the data management team and manages compute resources and AIS data assets for the group. He is also involved in MEOPAR, MEOPAR, being responsible for managing the organization's Satellite AIS Data Initiative and is the coordinator for the Canadian Marine Shipping Risk Forum. Sarah Vela, Data Manager, Meridian. Sarah is a data manager with Meridian who has been focused primarily on constructing the back end of the Discovery Portal. Her background is in library science and digital humanities, and she has worked in similar roles constructing graphical user interface information management tools for museums, universities, and other research groups. Kim is a data manager with Meridian. Their focus has been on the metadata schema and the first iteration of the user interface for the Discovery Portal. Their background is in library science and experimental physics. Kim has been involved, I'm losing my, sorry. Sorry, I just can't see that for a second there. With the Discovery Portal from the start of the Meridian project. Welcome to our presenters today, Casey, Sarah, and Kim. I'm going to stop sharing my screen now, and they're going to take over the presentation.
Perfect. Thank you very much. I'm just going to get my screen shared here. All right. Get some of these out of the way. Okay, perfect. Thanks very much for the introduction. I'm going to present here some content that myself, Kim, and Sarah have put together to give an introduction to Meridian and our newly released Discovery platform. So just a brief overview of what you can expect to find here. I'm going to first introduce Meridian and who we are, what we are, talk a little bit about the projects and initiatives aside from what we call the Discovery Portal. Then I'll get into more detail of that initiative, give some details about what it is, give a brief demonstration to just sort of introduce folks to how it works, and then I'll talk about if folks are interested in what that is, how they might reuse that platform or indeed use it, and then talk shortly about some planned works, what we have upcoming. So by way of introduction, so Meridian is the marine environmental research infrastructure for data integration and application network. So that's a bit of a mouthful. So I'll go into further details about how we make that real. So we're a CFI, Canada Foundation for Innovation, and provincially funded group. We are multi-institutional, so we're spread across a couple of different institutes on the coasts, largely of Canada, and we have some, highly skilled team members coming from the ocean acoustic research realm, as well as computer science and data science communities. So we aim to provide support for ocean acoustic research and researchers through software development, developing training materials and activities, and also sort of the focus of this particular bit on metadata discovery and management. So as you can see here on the left, we've got our funders, so CFI, as well as the institutions at which we are hosted, and the the provinces where those universities are located. We also have some commercial support as well from Exact Earth Limited and JASCO Applied Sciences. Then we also partner in sort of undertaking our activities with a wide variety of research institutions across Canada, and also to some small degree in the United States. So as I mentioned, we're pan-Canadian, mostly located on the coasts. We're 24 members strong, located at, as you can see, Dal, Université du Québec à Rimouski, Simon Fraser, University of British Columbia, and also at UVic. So what we do, really focuses around, ocean data, specifically underwater acoustic data, and other resources and other types of data that have a linkage with that. So we aim to make that particular stream of data more valuable by seeking it out, describing it, making it discoverable and reusable more broadly. We also are involved in the development of software to help analyze and model underwater acoustics, and also help with the visualization of the same. We don't, as a group, however, collect any data, and we don't actually store data. So we're more about facilitation, but not actually about the collection. So this is a list, aside from the Discovery portal, of initiatives that we have ongoing. So I'll just sort of briefly run through them and give a sense of what each of these mean. So first up, the Ocean Soundscape Atlas is developed by a UCAR team in Quebec at Rimouski. And what this is a web application to visualize underwater acoustic data in general, and also with respect to its potential impacts on organisms that are in the water. So that's a very interesting novel tool that I encourage folks to check out. We also have CADLU, which is a Python toolkit to facilitate underwater environmental noise modeling. So that is modeling the underwater noise impacts of things like waves and precipitation. Ketos is a Python toolkit for, it's a suite of detectors and code to enable detection and classification of, to date, largely biological signals within underwater acoustic data using deep neural networks. As an example, there's recently been published research using this toolkit to identify the signals from North Atlantic right whales, so the recently highlighted in the news very endangered whale species in the Gulf of St. Lawrence, among other detectors. Now that's a Python package on its own. It currently has, through Meridian, a GUI interface in development. We also collaborate with underwater acoustic researchers around AIS data. So AIS data is a source of shipborne position information largely. So we partner with a private group, Exact Earth Limited, to make available some of their data to researchers on a limited basis. And in that, we're working with folks at DAO, at UVic, and also some within the Department of Fisheries and Oceans. Lastly, here we do quite a bit of education and outreach aimed work. So we've developed a marine mammal quiz application to help folks become more familiar with some of the acoustic emissions of the folks, our friends in the sea, so marine mammals. So that's one piece of outreach that's aimed at sort of a broad group, but also in particular towards, for use in education. We've developed a group decision-making support tool. So that's a tool to aid folks making decisions where there are multiple parties who have to sort of contribute each of their individual thoughts about decisions, and then sort of gives a clever way to bundle that together and show the group sort of their collective decision. And we also host workshops on a variety of topics, sort of ranging from machine learning model development up to big data management. So this is the core piece here, talking about the metadata submission and discovery portal. This whole initiative was developed in response to a gap that was identified as Meridian was coming into being. So of course we have a lot of ocean acoustic researchers among our group, and it was identified that firstly, there's a large and growing volume of underwater acoustic data that are being gathered, as well as that are known to exist. And also it was recognized that this particular type of data is becoming increasingly in demand, one, due to increased international interest on the impacts of anthropogenic noise in the ocean. So that's shipborne noise, among other different types of exploratory noise, acoustic soundings, and so on. But also this data set seems to have good value or good application for machine learning approaches, seeking to increase what can be extracted from a given transect of this type of data. And so it was decided that by building a tool to help holders of this data to describe that data, build some metadata, and then subsequently make it available, that looking at building this tool would be an appropriate way forward. So mostly what we're looking at in terms of data description are primarily passive acoustic data, but also acoustic model data, and then any other resources that come into common with this data set, so software and information about detections and so on. The first cut at this problem was to describe the type of metadata we'd be interested in collecting, or that we thought would well support and describe this data. So we built an initial profile based on the ISO 19115 standard. We selected this due to its use in the international OOS concept, so ocean observing concept. It's adopted quite widely already internationally, and we thought that this data was a good parallel for what we were hoping to do. We've also augmented it a bit, in particular where the acoustic data, or one stream, one thread of using this acoustic data was biologically considered. We've added a bit of Darwin core structure to capture that a bit more effectively. As well, these sort of other related data sets that we've had to think about and work into here include, modeled output as opposed to just observed data, and then related software, as well as AIS data in recognition of the fact that, for one, this is an increasingly used way to measure where ships are, and that's quite helpful in acoustic modeling. So this is just what I think is a very pretty illustration of how that metadata profile looks. As a slide, perhaps not too practical, except in to say that, that it's possible to go to this, one of our main Meridian websites, and then view that whole profile so that you can dig into it and really see how it describes things. So at a high level, what we were hoping to do, or what we are hoping to do with the metadata submission and discovery portal is, one, to allow users to record metadata about these resources, sort of full stop. We also hope to offer them a concise schema so that they're not overburdened in that task, and also provide them a means to sort of meet that metadata schema. And then on the other side of this this effort, to provide folks a way to find these resources, including institutional repository interactions, harvesting, and exposure. So this is sort of the very high level view of what we have implemented. So moving from left to right, we've got our metadata submission form. So that's implemented largely in Node.js. All the information that's gathered from the users there is then fed into a MongoDB document store. That's responsive to sort of edits and amendments that users may make through the submission form. The results of that are exported through an XML into a GeoNetwork instance. Within GeoNetwork, we have the facility to both expose our metadata to other institutions, and also at that point harvest from external institutions as well. All of the information, once it sort of passes GeoNetwork, lands in an Elasticsearch search appliance, and then we query that with our discovery portal on the far end. So I'm going to now hope to transition to a bit of a demonstration. Maybe. There we are. Okay, so forgive the desktop. This is sort of where you land. This is the submission form side of things. So you can see here the 5 key types of records that we aim to have described here. So software, it's a bit reversed, I suppose, but software records relating to ocean acoustic data, ocean model output records, AIS data, acoustic data, which is sort of our key bit that we hope to capture, as well as bioacoustic data, sort of hinting to the fact that in addition to the raw acoustic data, oftentimes there are, for example, detections of particular species, and that's meant to be captured within these bioacoustic data records. Moving up to the top, you can see sort of the functionality we offered. So submit a record, this is a parallel of below. A link out to the discovery portal, which I'll get to shortly. A link to help guides. So these are the general overarching documentation of, for example, the metadata profile itself, but then also how to use the discovery portal in a general sense. We offer a means to contact us as a sort of help desk type of communication. So if there are specific issues or problems or requests for features, for example, that's where that can be provided. And then lastly here, in recognition of the fact that entering metadata can sometimes be a hopefully we won't call it tedious, but a temporally long process, it's beneficial, of course, to save things rather than having to put them all through at one shot. So we built an account system where candidate users can sign up or log in, and then save intermediate records and track things that are in process, as well as revisit things that they've submitted previously. So I'll just call out, without getting too deeply into the records piece, I'll call out that 2 elements that we had noted in our initial feedback in developing this that are required to be entered frequently, which becomes tedious, is that the notion of people or organizations is something that's frequently repeated. So we added the facility to sort of pre-enter or save these individual people, being that they're usually atomic. They don't really change particularly much in this sense. We added this facility so you can reuse them, which I'll show in a moment. And similarly with operations, which are sort of like you can imagine a grouped set of efforts which might generate multiple data records. an ocean-going cruise that might generate multiple data sets would be an example of that type of effort. So to just sort of show a bit of how this works in practice, if I pop over, I'll pick AIS because that's largely my background in this. You can see here, first of all, there's an information button that gives some sort of high-level details about how you would go about using this form to enter the metadata. And then next, we've taken that overall schema for each of those 5 different record types and then tried to aggregate up the information into sort of more digestible parcels, so citation details, resource, extent, methods, etc. Just to gather them together in mentally coherent chunks to sort of lower the thinking burden when we're trying to put in this. So I can give in some sample information, generally iterating through the fields. I'll call particular note, here's where that notion of persons is a value. So rather than having to enter all of these individual components of a person or organization, we're able to go to those that we've previously entered and provide that detail, or we could enter them here and if they were to save this record, so here's this somewhat nonsense record, we can go back and edit it and then reuse that individual in different areas. So that's sort of how that functionality is intended to proceed. Okay. So to spare the gory details, I have a record that's for the most part complete, which I'll pop back into. So imagining that you've gone through the exercise of describing citation and resource, I'll just call out a particular note. We do have a spatial component in the metadata that we capture so that it's possible to indicate where these data assets are. That was something that was denoted as particularly of interest to our stakeholders. And then I'll proceed along, again, imagining that you've gone through this exercise. Prior to, for example, submitting this record, it's possible to view at a glance on the summary page, how the data that you've entered compares to what's required for this particular record type. So you can see here the notation that elements with an orange box are mandatory, proceeding from left to right. So you can see here, of course, title would be required, and scanning down, languages which weren't entered are actually not required to be entered, and so on and so on. You can see here is a good example of something where if again, a person entry is entered as an updater, it would be required that they do have an email, but not required that they have any other particular information. So popping back to the profile, imagining that you were to submit that record, and now sort of looking at how the records appear here, you can see the various status here. So an in-progress record is one that's been saved, whereas a pending review one has been submitted and it's waiting for, at this point, myself, Sarah, or Kim to look through and then make that transition through XML over to GeoNetwork. At the end here, a couple of bits to note. I've sort of used them without making reference to them. Of course, edit, this button here, is to either return to editing a record in progress, or for a previously submitted record that needs amendment, they can be edited and then resubmitted for review again. The button on the left, clone, is useful for particularly where you have distinct resources where they're quite similar but have minimal change between them. Clone can be used to clone either an existing or an in-progress record to sort of save some of that, save some time on data entry. I'll hint at this. So the next It's our intention in the next release of the portal, on the other end of this whole process, it'll be possible to click through and directly land on the records that have been entered. And so with that in mind, I'll pop over to the Discovery portal just to show sort of what that looks like. So I have to mention at this point, it's a bit early days for our platform, so we have relatively few records in here, just a few to really illustrate the functionality. And I'll go into detail on that a little bit afterwards, but essentially we have search by keyword or location or by particular element out of the metadata record. So if I'm to enter some type of keyword, which is obviously a search that I anticipated, you can see here we have some facets, presuming that at some point there will be more than one record in these results, so it'll be possible to filter or sort. Then also we can look at the details of the record and see all of that information that would have been entered in the previous forms. Just one last bit that I'll call out here, since it's something we worked hard to make sure it was included. Of course, you can also search by geographic area, and as we might expect, the record that we'd already seen with Gaspé also pops up there. Okay, so I'll pop back over to the presentation at this point, if I can. Okay, so just quickly a couple of notes on reuse. Of course, I mentioned earlier the profile that we've developed. We put quite a bit of good work into it and a lot of documentation. So that's openly available for folks that might be undertaking this exercise on a data set that they think is similar. We also plan to make the interface and backend code open source. This is sort of in progress. We had hoped to have a link that we could put directly in your hands today, but realistically later this week, that will be open. So anyone that's planning on operating a similar portal, they can look at what we've done. If it seems to be along the lines of what you'd like to put in place, and directly copy out that code and modify as needed. It should be mentioned, of course, this isn't sort of a immediate plug and play. It does rely on having a web team, for lack of a better term. Also worth mentioning, of course, the underlying architecture that we've used. So that is MongoDB, GeoNetwork, Elasticsearch, all of those are open source as well. So looking in the future for the metadata portal in specific, we recognize that we have relatively few records in there at the moment, and of course we put a great deal of our work to date on the submission piece, with a plan to sort of be responsive to user queries in further enhancing the search functionality. And we'll also be looking at this point, locating institutions for whom our metadata would be of interest, and on the other side of that coin, looking to organizations, institutional repositories that hold data that would be of relevance to our users, to our existing users, in terms of ocean acoustics. For Meridian more generally, we are planning to host an online workshop series on big data management. This is tentatively scheduled for June. This is actually a replacement for 2 in-person workshops that have been put aside by the current COVID situation. There is active development ongoing with CATOS, particularly in developing additional detectors and the graphical interface that I mentioned earlier. As well, Meridian is exploring the feasibility of establishing a benchmark data set for machine learning for acoustic purposes. So this would be an analog to what ImageNet has done for machine learning for video and imagery. Just want to say thank you very much for your time. I've got some links in here. I understand the presentation will be made available, so please do check out the submission and search portal if it's something up your alley, and certainly do contact us if you have any questions that we don't cover here.
Thank you so much. So we will now open it up to questions. You can feel free to pop your questions in the chat, or you can raise your hand and I'll allow you to speak, and you're welcome to ask your question that way as well. So whichever you would prefer, and we'll keep an eye on that. And will facilitate that question. Hi, John. I can see that you have a question in the chat. I've permitted you to speak, so you can unmute yourself and follow up with that question.
Oh, thank you. Can you hear me?
We can.
Great. Okay. Yeah, I think, I was interested in knowing a bit more about the way that the search indexing happens, I guess, whether that's across or whether there's kind of whether that's a database behind the search mechanism, or if it's something like Solar indexing or Lucene, something like that.
Sure, I think I can field that one. So the current implementation with Elasticsearch, it's sort of its own index. So the records are exported. It's sort of like an automated export from GeoNetwork into that, and so it's just sort of a search appliance. So it has its own API, and then the front end of the search interface passes along those API calls. So we sort of wrap those. It's worth mentioning that one of the pieces that we're considering around this, of course, if you look at that architecture diagram, it seems a bit peculiar that we have a database on one end and then a database on the other end. So we're looking at whether or not it would be feasible to use, for example, the MongoDB database to support the backend searching rather than integrating this extra piece of infrastructure. The reason why we have Elastic there right now is that's something that's natively supported in GeoNetwork, so we've sort of carried that forward.
Right. Okay, thank you.
Thank you. So our next question is from Greg. Is there an API for bulk submission of metadata?
So right now I would say that to submit directly into GeoNetwork, you can make use of things like CSW or IPMH to submit metadata, or we can set up a harvest from you. But into MongoDB, not yet. That's something we're looking into going forward. Does that answer the question more or less?
Thank you. Greg, just pop it in the chat if you have additional questions to follow up on. I don't see any follow-up questions based on that. Anybody else have any questions? Again, please raise your hand or pop something in the chat if you have a question for our presenters today.
So I think I see one in the question and answer there. Do we have access to these slides? The link is open. As I understand, perhaps Melanie could indicate, I think they will be hosted or at least linked to elsewhere.
Yes, absolutely. So you'll receive a follow-up email after the presentation where you'll have access to the slides as well as a recording from today and any additional links that we'll be providing. So yes, you will have access. Any additional questions before we wrap up for today? Again, you can pop them in the chat, use the Q&A feature, or raise your hand. And a question from Kelly. Do you currently harvest any repositories in bulk, or is it all individual submissions?
So at this point, it's individual submissions, but that's sort of something I sort of alluded to there. Essentially, what we're looking for right now is we're sort of polling the waters to see which repositories would be relevant to integrate alongside what we have already. So I'm currently engaged with CEUS, and we're talking about whether there might be some potential there, but we don't have any that at the moment we're harvesting.
If I can just elaborate on that, Casey, I'm assuming people can hear. Yeah, the issue we face with that is unless the metadata that people have collected independently matches up, at least in what's there, even if the structure is not the same, it's like we at least need to crosswalk it in. But if there's just big gaps and we're relying on those fields for the search capability, then it's one of those things where we need to go back to the people who have provided that original data to see if we can fill in those gaps, which is going to slow down the speed at which we can kind of access any bulk harvesting.
Thank you. And an additional question from Omid. Regarding the open source applications, is there any documentation on how to use them?
So
This is Ketos, those sort of open applications?
I think so. So I can sort of speak to both. Certainly for the software packages, there's extensive documentation for both of those. And then the code that we have for the portal and the search infrastructure, there is suitable documentation to sort of go through and repurpose it. But again, probably not at the point of sort of just immediately turning around and applying it, for example, in a different metadata context entirely. So, you know, if you wanted to use this to describe literature, for example, that would be quite a bit more of an effort than, for example, using it for non-underwater acoustics. So that's sort of the current state of those.
Thank you. And our next question from John. Do you have any interesting stories or cases of people who have used the platform to discover data? This is a bit of a long shot question.
So for this one, it's a bit trickier. So the platform itself, I'd have to say no. We're in quite early days. However, I will say that through the exercise of building the platform and Meridian as an entity, certainly we've linked researchers across coasts that had previously not been in contact. So not as much, you know, direct use of a specific data set, but certainly in terms of, for example, from my experience, using AIS data to quantify where ships are when looking at acoustic measurements to sort of determine, okay, are there ships in this particular measurement? We've certainly linked on quite a few researchers to resources that were otherwise sort of invisible to them. So.
Thank you. And again, any questions that you have for today's presenters, you can pop those into the Q&A. You can put them in the chat, or you can raise your hand and I'll unmute you. So again, we're still open for questions before we wrap up today. And another question in the chat. Do you have any data contribution from the ONC?
So we don't at current. but through CUSE, I've been in contact with ONC, so that's something that's potentially kind of down the road. So.
Again, any questions, you can add them to the Q&A, raise your hand, or place them in the chat. We do have a question. Please include links to your upcoming big data management course and webinars in the follow-up email. So we'll make sure to do that. If you have links to those, we'll share those back with the group.
Perfect. That's good to hear. Yeah. So that's yeah, it's a little bit in the works now, but you know, of course, with this situation evolving in Nova Scotia, I will say the week where we were to do these or conduct these in-person events was literally the week that everyone is advised to head home and stay home. So we were quite anxious that, you know, we had quite a bit of work already put into them. So yeah, certainly that will be, it's good to hear that there's interest, and we'll certainly follow up and try to spread the word as broadly as we can.
Okay, so our final call for questions. We'll leave it for one more minute. If you have any questions, please place them in the Q&A or in the chat, or raise your hand and I'll enable you to speak. All right, so it looks like there's no more questions today. We do thank our presenters for sharing this content with us. For those of you that are interested, we will be passing along the presentation slides, as well as you'll receive a link to the recording and a survey on today's webinar. If you have any questions, you can feel free to get in touch with me directly at Portage, and I'm happy to pass along anything. And of course, you can, I'm sure our presenters would be happy if you reached out to them as well. Again, thank you all for attending, and please keep checking the Portage website. We'll be sharing any upcoming webinars. Our goal is to be hosting these regularly throughout this time. So if you're interested in attending future webinars, you can check out our website for more information. Again, thank you all for attending.
Thank you very much for the opportunity.